I found her on the porch, bleeding, not enough to be life-threatening, but enough that her cardigan was torn, one shoe missing, and her glasses cracked where they'd hit the edge of the iron bench. The front gate was still open. She didn't cry. She just said very softly, "They grabbed my arm. My name is Eli Mackenzie. I've seen war zones quieter than that cul-de-sac when I stepped onto the porch that afternoon. We bought this property because of her. After 3 decades in the Navy, most of them buried under salt water and silence, I told myself I'd give her stillness, fruit trees, a wide porch swing, a garden. Instead, she got a clipboard shoved in her face and 2 men shouting about unauthorized planter boxes. I wasn't home when it happened. I had driven into town to get fertilizer and a part for the gate opener. According to the security footage, and we had 4 cameras running, 2 HOA enforcers walked up to her without a single warning letter or prior notice. One of them pointed to the tulip beds she planted by the walkway and told her they were non-compliant. She said calmly that our property was listed as grandfathered in before the HOA was formed. He said that was irrelevant now. The footage shows them trying to pull up the small plastic fence she'd placed to keep the dogs out. She stepped between them and the garden. That's when the larger one shoved her aside. They walked off like nothing had happened. I didn't call the police right away. I asked my wife if she wanted to. She just looked at me and said, "I want them to know what they touched." I replayed the footage 5 times, slowed it down, measured the shoulder movement, the angle of the wrist. These weren't just HOA. Volunteers. These were men used to being feared. One had a badge-shaped outline faded into his belt. Private security? The other? Looked ex-military but undisciplined. It takes less than a second to spot a coward in a uniform. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I took out the folder I keep under the bed. Copies of the land plat, the title deeds, the incorporation timeline of the HOA, and a few other things. I knew where to start. Because here's what they didn't know. Our property was never legally part of the HOA. The houses that were, they were built on a grading variance I personally reviewed 5 years ago as part of a federal erosion study. I had signed off on the land stability survey under a civilian contract post-retirement, meaning I had standing, and more importantly, I had leverage. I pulled up the drone footage we took before laying the garden. The property boundary line was clear. The HOA had no jurisdiction. In fact, the moment they stepped over the front gate, they were trespassing. And if you assault someone while trespassing, that's felony battery. I called a friend from my SEAL unit, now a JAG attorney in state, and sent over the footage. His reply was short. "They just handed you everything you need." That night, I watched the street from our porch. The clipboard guy drove past twice, slower each time. I didn't wave, just sat there, arms crossed, not moving. They expected silence, or maybe a frantic lawsuit they could bury under paperwork. Instead, they assaulted a woman whose husband spent 10 years training for one thing: how to quietly dismantle enemies without drawing blood. So I smiled, sat back in the swing she'd once begged me to hang, and began the work of making them disappear. The porch swing creaked once, twice. I let it settle into rhythm as I watched the street from the shadows. Every motion was deliberate. In my line of work, patience wasn't a virtue. It was a weapon, and right now, I was sharpening it. I didn't start with threats. I started with blueprints. I pulled the original development maps from county archives online. I cross-referenced them with the HOA's incorporation documents, ones most homeowners had probably never bothered to read. They were dry, bureaucratic, buried in subclauses and exceptions. But to someone like me, it was an operational weakness, waiting to be exploited. The HOA had formed 3 years ago, after the original builder went bankrupt mid-phase. Half the homes were sold under old covenants, the rest bundled into a newly formed association trying to regain control. Our property built before the split, was never legally annexed. It was a clean carve-out, protected by an easement agreement that expired before the HOA was even ratified. Legally? We were a sovereign lot. I printed out the tax map overlays and stapled them to a corkboard in my garage, next to my tools, and a weathered photo of my old SEAL team. One by one, I added colored string between parcels, plotting HOA jurisdiction, known enforcement actions, and specific board member addresses. That's when I noticed something. Each enforcement dispute, dozens of them, was clustered around the outer edge of the development. The older homes, the grandfathered properties, the same ones technically outside their legal reach. They were targeting those owners anyway, hoping no one would fight back. Pattern, motive, liability. I needed one. More angle. Someone inside. Her name was Denise Calder. Widow, late 60s, sharp eyes. Her late husband had been one of the original homeowners. He'd tried to fight the HOA's jurisdiction claim and lost. Not because he was wrong, but because he couldn't afford the lawsuit. They'd buried him in paperwork until he died of a stroke. Denise, however, had kept everything. She slid a manila envelope across the table to me that afternoon, her fingers trembling. "They think no one remembers," she whispered. "Inside." Meeting minutes, redlined edits, unsigned amendment drafts, including one from the year after the HOA formed, an illegal document where the board attempted to retroactively annex 5 lots. Ours was one of them. The vote had failed. The paper had never been filed. And yet they still acted as if it passed. Forgery. Thanked her, quietly. Then copied everything. Now I had 3 angles: illegal annexation, repeated harassment of exempt homeowners, and physical assault. All provable, all damning. But I needed the right moment to strike. So I waited. The man who shoved my wife was named Randall Kirk. Private security contractor, not licensed for enforcement. The HOA had brought him on after a supposed uptick in vandalism, but according to Denise and 3 other neighbors, there hadn't been a single verified police report. Just HOA emails claiming concern, manufactured fear, justification for hiring muscle. I called a buddy, former Intel analyst who now worked in data mining. I asked him to dig into Randall's certifications. 36 hours later, he called back. "Eli, you're going to want to see this." Randall's license had been revoked 2 years ago in another state due to excessive force. He wasn't even supposed to be carrying a baton, let alone engaging homeowners. He'd moved states, rebranded under a different LLC, and picked up subcontractor. Work in smaller counties that didn't run deep background checks. I printed everything, built the timeline, then added it to the packet labeled Phase 1. The next Saturday, the HOA held its quarterly meeting in the community hall. I didn't walk in angry. I walked in silent. They didn't recognize me at first. I'd shaved the beard, wore slacks and a windbreaker. Just another homeowner. But when the agenda item reached enforcement concerns, I raised my hand. The room quieted. I handed a printed folder to each board member. "This is a formal notice of cease and desist against the HOA for unlawful enforcement actions on my property, Lot 12. I've also included documentation proving your annexation attempt failed, making your jurisdiction over my land void." Gasps. One board member tried to interrupt. "You can respond through legal counsel," I said. I didn't yell, didn't need to. I turned to Randall, who was standing near the back in a security vest, arms crossed. "And you?" I said, holding up the revoked license printout, "have 30 seconds to leave the premises before I make a citizen's arrest for impersonating a licensed officer." He froze, flinched, then walked out. I turned back to the board. "I suggest you consult your bylaws before your next action. This is your warning." And then I walked out too. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Back in my garage, I moved every folder, from Phase 1 to Phase 2. Legal filings, injunction drafts, police reports. The trap was set. I wasn't here to scare them. I was here to erase their authority, one clause at a time, and when I was done, they wouldn't just lose their power, they'd lose everything they built it on. The sun was still low when I parked across from the courthouse. Phase 2 wasn't about threats. It was about precision. A cease and desist was a warning shot. Now I was walking in with artillery. I filed a civil complaint for unlawful enforcement, trespassing, and assault, backed by property records, revoked license documentation, and the HOA's own failed annexation attempt. Denise Calder signed a supporting affidavit. 2 other neighbors followed after I showed them what I'd found. The clerk didn't blink. "You're the 3rd HOA case this week." "Not like this one," I said, calmly sliding over a second envelope. "That's for the county attorney. It includes evidence of tax fraud." It hit harder than I let on. The HOA had been collecting dues and claiming maintenance responsibility for properties they legally didn't control. That meant misrepresented assets, false filings, and potential wire fraud under federal statutes. The storm started quietly. First, a letter from the county's zoning office. It cited improper authority for enforcing landscaping codes outside HOA jurisdiction. Then, a sheriff's deputy arrived at Randall Kirk's residence with a citation for unlicensed security activity. His contract with the HOA was voided within a week. He didn't fight it, probably because he didn't want the judge reviewing his old case files again. Next, I filed an injunction temporarily freezing HOA enforcement on exempt lots until jurisdiction could be clarified. They panicked. Board members started holding emergency meetings. One tried to resign quietly, another tried to delete past emails. I already had copies, metadata included, and then came the audit. Remember the buddy who dug into Randall's license? He had another contact, a forensic accountant, who owed him a favor. She went through 5 years of HOA expenditures and noticed something odd. Nearly $42,000 paid to a landscaping company that didn't exist outside the association's records. Shell vendor. Likely embezzlement. She prepared a forensic summary and mailed it anonymously to the state's regulatory board. Within days, the HOA president was served publicly. At the next meeting, I attended again, this time in a collared shirt. Not a threat, just a presence. 2 chairs were empty. One board member stood, shaking. "We'd like to propose a suspension of all enforcement activities pending internal review." I didn't nod, didn't smile. I just said, "You're not, in a position to propose anything." They were unraveling, and I wasn't done. I filed a separate complaint with the State Attorney General's office. Deceptive practices, selective enforcement, and false representation. Denise and others added their signatures. Then I called the local news. I didn't need to appear on camera. I just sent them the folder. 1 week later, it aired. Retired Navy SEAL uncovers illegal HOA scheme in suburban county. They used a silhouette shot and changed my name. But the documents were real. So was the panic. Homeowners started knocking on my door, not to threaten me, to thank me, to ask how they could help. I handed them forms. Petitions to dissolve the HOA state law required a supermajority. At first, I only had 17 signatures. But once people understood what the board had been hiding, the fraudulent annexation, the illegal dues, the surveillance notices without legal ground, it spread like fire. Within 3 weeks, we had 53. The dissolution vote was scheduled. But the HOA wasn't done swinging. They tried to file a restraining order, claimed I was intimidating board members. The judge tossed it, then sanctioned them for filing without cause. They tried to propose a new amendment to retroactively authorize their enforcement. But they didn't have quorum anymore. Half the community had revoked recognition, and finally they tried the oldest trick in the book, delay. Last-minute filings, proxy disputes, challenge letters to the county didn't matter because I'd anticipated all of it. The morning of the vote, I stood quietly in the back as each ballot was counted in front of a notary. Final tally: in favor of dissolution. 4 opposed, The HOA was dead, but I wasn't done. I turned back to the county attorney, provided updated documentation. The civil complaint became a criminal investigation, and when Randall Kirk tried to file for a new security license under a third alias, the system flagged him. Because now, there was a record. The day the final sign came down from the HOA gates, I didn't throw a party. I hung my wife's wind chimes back on the porch and let the silence speak for itself. But inside my garage, where the corkboard still hung, I added one last piece of string, from Lot 12 to Justice Served, and I left it there. As a reminder, for anyone who ever forgot what quiet power looks like. The old HOA sign sat on the curb for 3 days before the trash service finally took it. I didn't watch them haul it off. I was inside, finishing coffee while my wife read aloud from a gardening catalog. Her voice was steadier now. She smiled. More. We had our porch back. The wind chimes tinkled. The sun moved across Lot 12 like it always had. Only now it was free. But the story didn't end with the vote. The takedown had ripple effects. Real ones. The county issued a full cease order against the former HOA board, pending review of their financial practices. 2 members were disqualified from holding fiduciary office in the state for the next 7 years. Another accepted a plea deal in exchange for testifying against the treasurer. Randall Kirk, arrested for violating probation and attempting to impersonate law enforcement. Again, the Department of Consumer Affairs opened a formal investigation into the shell companies used in the embezzlement trail. At least 3 state senators requested documentation from our case to propose new HOA reform legislation, but none of that was the victory. The real victory came in quieter ways. Neighbors started walking their dogs without looking over their shoulder. One woman planted a row of lavender where the HOA once cited her for non-native flora. We installed a community bulletin board, one without threats, fees, or agendas. Just announcements, potlucks, lost keys. A new committee was formed, not an HOA, but a volunteer advisory group. No power, just service, and they asked me to be on it. I said no. I'd done my part. Besides, my wife wanted chickens again. We took down the last of the old perimeter signs that week. One still had the HOA's mission statement etched in metal. Order, control, excellence. I replaced it with a hand-painted plank. Welcome to Lot 12. Peace lives here. But there was one last chapter to finish. 6 months after the HOA dissolution, I received a call from a young lawyer in a nearby city. She said her father had been pushed off his land years ago under similar HOA pressure, but he never fought back. She heard about our case. She wanted to start a foundation, help others, build a legal team for homeowners pushed around by fake authority and weaponized bureaucracy. I gave her everything I had, documents, strategies, contacts, and then I donated $5,000 to her fund. Why? She asked. Because the next guy might not be a Navy SEAL, I said, but he still deserves to win. She cried. I didn't. I walked out to the porch that evening, the smell of rosemary and dust on the wind, and listened to the quiet I'd earned. There were no cameras, no applause, just the low rustle of freedom across a few acres of Texas dirt. And every sunrise since then has brought the same reminder. They thought they could take my land. They laid hands on my wife, but in doing so, they gave me permission to end them. Legally, permanently. And now, they wake every morning without a title to control, without a nameplate to hide behind, and without the power they once abused. But I still have Lot 12, the same porch, the same wife, and a legacy built not from rage, but from quiet power, a power that never needed to shout, only to endure, and endure it did. I never wanted a fight, but they brought one. So I ended it with paperwork, and a porch swing, and a wind chime they'll never hear again.